Hello again, welcome back to the Day of Daily Bible Study. We're continuing on with the Gospel according to Matthew. We're in chapter 22. We're going to start in verse 23 and Jesus answering the Sadducees. I'm going to read the passage and we're going to talk about, to be honest, most of what we're going to talk about is going to be about how people respond to it, and because there's so much emotion that gets caught up in this, and rightly so. So on that day, some Sadducees who say there is no resurrection came to Jesus and questioned him, asking, "Teacher, Moses said, if a man dies having no children, his brother as next of kin shall marry his wife and raise up children for his brother. Now there were 7 brothers with us, and the first married and died, having no children left his wife to his brother. So also the second and the third down to the 7th. Last of all, the woman died. In the resurrection, therefore, whose wife of the 7 will she be? For they all had married her." But Jesus answered and said to them, "You are mistaken, not understanding the Scriptures, nor the power of God. For in the resurrection they neither marry nor are given in marriage, but are like angels in heaven. But regarding the resurrection of the dead, have you not all read what was spoken to you by God? I am the God of Abraham, and the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. He is not the God of the dead, but of the living." When the crowds heard this, they were astonished at his teaching. So the traditional interpretation of this is that Jesus is teaching this idea that there is a resurrection, and yet this idea that marriage in this world will not endure into the future. That has been the classic interpretation of this is what this text means. And as you might imagine, people who love their spouses and would like to continue to have this relationship into the future have some emotional feelings about this. I have some emotional feelings about this. When I preached on this text, I found that my wife had some pretty strong emotional feelings about this. And I probably had more people come up to me and talk to me about it after the fact than any others. Which is sometimes when lots of people have things they think about in relation to your sermon, they're mad at you about it. It was always phrased in terms of, "That was very interesting, help me understand it." Now, I think it's important to realize that even if that interpretation is given, and that certainly has been the overwhelming consensus in the history of the church, even if that is the interpretation, it doesn't mean that there's not some kind of relationship. To whatever degree, it would be to highlight the fact that, in fact, you can even argue that, so we have things like there's one bishop in heaven, and it's Jesus. There's one Lord who is in heaven, it's Jesus. We have various elders described in the kingdom of heaven and all the rest. But there is a biblical precedent for saying that, for example, the reason why that in the New Testament we don't read about other gods at all, we read about demons and unclean spirits, and whereas we do read about other gods in the Old Testament is in part due to the fact that there's this development throughout the Old Testament of, first we say, yeah, there's other gods, but our God is the best God. Our God's the most important God. Our God's the real God. And then later on, you have this idea that we're like, well, they use the same word to describe them, but they're so different that we really shouldn't use the same word God to describe both the one God and also these other people, other things that the nations call gods. And to the point where we're not even playing that game anymore, not even pretending to use the same word. It could be argued that the marriage between Christ and his people is so profound, so completely deeper and more profound than anything that we experience, that it doesn't make sense to use the same word to describe it. I think there's a possibility for that kind of interpretation. But I raise all this to say a couple things here. That it is important to realize that part of this is that we just had the Pharisees and the Herodians in the last passage, and now we have the Sadducees. We have essentially then gone through all the major factions that are going on. All the groups of people who tend to hate each other have all agreed they hate Jesus. That the Sadducees and the Pharisees vie for power in Jerusalem. And we've known that Jesus stands against the Pharisees because there were a lot more Pharisees in Galilee where Jesus kind of grew up than there are Sadducees. And now we're finding out that Jesus has made everybody mad. We don't read about the Zealots as a group anywhere in the New Testament, but they probably don't like him either. And so it's important to realize that this is part of this function here of why it's showing up where it is to show that Jesus has not only failed to secure the endorsements of the Herodians and also of the Pharisees, but also of the Sadducees. So I think that's part of this. Also, it's important to highlight that just like the Pharisees came in with the Herodians to say, oh, you're impartial. You don't show any preference, so you'll give us the truth. but even though they don't want the truth, and they definitely had an interest. At the same time, with the Sadducees who are saying, like, we have this question about how the resurrection works. We're just a little bit confused about this finer point of doctrine, when in fact they don't believe there's a resurrection at all. They think the whole thing's ridiculous. They're trying to make Jesus look ridiculous. So those are important things as well. And Jesus is trying to talk about this notion of, the resurrection and the nature of God and the structure that God is the God of the living rather than the dead. Okay, so here's the thing. Like a while ago, I got a hold of this. I was brought to my attention a document about this question, or rather, it specifically is addressing the parallel passage in Luke, and it was an article, a scholarly article that was challenging this kind of consensus opinion that the point of this is that it's trying to say there's going to be this eternal celibacy into the into the indefinite future. And they're making an argument, and I must admit that I have not fully internalized all of the rationale. But I was trying to review it a little bit because I knew I was going to talk about it today. And some of it was saying that it's important to note that if Jesus is making this point, it is remarkable. This is the only place he does. He doesn't bring it up in other places. He talks about the resurrection in other places, but doesn't talk about eternal celibacy. I don't know how convincing that is in itself, because it was brought up by all three of the synoptic gospels anyway. What I find interesting is that there were a couple other points. It's a long article with many detailed things, and I couldn't review all of it very well today. But one of the points they were suggesting that this notion of that uses the language of in the resurrection they neither marry nor are given in marriage. And they make an argument to the effect that that language of marrying and given in marriage is meant to describe illicit or otherwise immoral marriages. And that is, that we see this in that the marrying and given in marriage is used to describe what's happening right before the flood. And they make the argument that the Old Testament and Second Temple Judaism, which would be the Judaism about the time of Jesus, and Jesus all seem to agree that these illicit marriages were what led to the flood in the first place. And I think that's pretty significant. But again, it's one of those things where it's possible that that the future state is more dynamic and more enduring with marriage than we might think. But I don't know enough. I haven't digested that particular perspective enough, and it certainly is a minority position. I think that I would still put my foot down more on this idea of the marriage between Christ and his people if that's really what marriage is, then we human beings are not participating in anything to that level of depth and intimacy. But that doesn't necessarily mean that what we think of as marriage would necessarily be done away with. But exactly what that looks like, I don't know. It's definitely a passage that people have lots of feelings about, and rightly so. And yet, exactly how it plays itself out, there's remarkably little being said in the New Testament. So if you have had some strong emotional responses to this passage in its various forms, you're not alone, nor are you being unreasonable. And apparently there's at least one other perspective out there that says that is arguing for the fact that not only will marriage endure into the God's final kingdom, but indeed childbearing will be as part. And part of the argument for that is that the blessing that the resurrection, the post-resurrection world, is meant to fulfill what God's original plan for creation was. And before the fall, the point was to be fruitful, to multiply, to fill the earth, those kinds of things. And this idea of long life and childbearing is used consistently throughout the Old Testament as being the blessing for God's people. This person's trying to find a spot for that in this. It's certainly food for thought. I haven't had a chance to really to dwell with that argument, but it certainly caught my attention, and I want to at least make you aware of the fact that such an argument does exist out there by people who are at least attempting to do good, solid scholarly work. I have no idea how it's been received by the New Testament community. I don't know that it's the kind of thing where there would be a lot of responses to it. But in any case, I feel like I'm slightly rambling a little bit, but it's an interesting passage. So, but that's all for today. Come back in tomorrow. We'll have more of the Gospel according to Matthew. Have a good day.